Coming up on New Day at Arirang, another day with well over 200,000 new daily cases of COVID-19 in South Korea as Omicron continues to run rampant. The daily figure has been in the 200,000 range for several days in a row, and there are fears it could jump even higher to fresh record highs in the days to come. The UN Security Council holds a closed-door informal meeting on North Korea after the regime's latest missile test. The meeting, called by the US, comes after the North said it conducted a test Saturday for what it claimed was a spy satellite. However, analysts say it was nothing more than a thinly veiled test of a ballistic missile. Plus, families split apart as refugees flee besieged Ukrainian cities into neighboring countries like the Czech Republic, Romania and Moldova.
Hello and welcome to this Tuesday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. March 8th here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Mo-gan.
And I'm Mark Brim. Over the course of the next 60 minutes, we'll be taking a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world. Our starting point, as per usual, is the COVID-19 situation. South Korea expecting to see new daily cases hover around the 200,000 mark on Tuesday, with the death toll expected to rise further in line with this surge of Omicron.
Now, given the current situation, authorities have said Omicron does not pose a serious threat to people's health if they have gotten their boosters. For more on this, our reporter Jae-myung is here in the studio with us. Good morning, Min-jung. Welcome back.
Good morning.
So let's start with the local front. What are you expecting today?
Right, Mo-gan, we're expecting to see more than 200,000 cases today. From midnight to 9 p.m. Monday, South Korea saw over 196,000 cases. This is down by around 3,500 cases from the day before, but still a 1.5-fold increase on week and double what was seen 2 weeks ago. With cases continuing to surge, authorities are bracing for further upticks in the number of severely ill patients as well as deaths. With 70 added just yesterday, we saw close to 1,000 critically ill patients, and authorities say this figure could potentially increase to more than 2,700. We've also been seeing daily numbers of deaths in the 3 digits, higher than what we witnessed at the end of last year when the Delta variant was prevalent. Authorities are expecting the death toll to continue to soar 2 to 4 weeks after the Omicron wave hits its peak.
Now, Min-jung, given this current situation, Korea has raised its risk level. It's now the highest point on its 5-tier evaluation system.
Right, Mark. The country's overall COVID-19 risk was bumped to very high over the past week. This, as you said, is the highest level in the 5-tier evaluation scheme. And it's the first in 9 weeks that the country has been designated as being at this level. Individual risk levels for both the Greater Seoul area and outside the capital region were also upgraded to very high. The KDCA chief explained that the revision comes as the occupancy rate for ICU beds continues to increase, passing 50%, and the number of deaths are expected to increase as well, with more people over 60 getting infected. Now, this also comes as recent data show that the Omicron strain accounted for 100% of infections. The subvariant of Omicron, also known as stealth Omicron, accounted for 23% of domestic cases, and the figure doubled within just a couple of days. All we know for now is that the stealth variant is 30% more transmissible than Omicron, but there are no significant differences in how severely it affects one's health or how effective vaccines are against it.
Well, on that point, Min-jung, authorities are saying the Omicron variant doesn't really pose a serious health threat if you got boosted. Tell us more on that.
Right, Mo-gan. Authorities revealed on Monday that the fatality rate is 0% for people under 60 who were infected with Omicron after getting booster shot. For people who are 60 and over, the rate increases to 0.52%, and the rate is around 5.5% for unvaccinated people in this age group. Over the past 3 weeks, the fatality rate of Omicron stayed at 0.1%, and authorities say the weekly fatality rate is getting to a point where it is similar to that of the seasonal flu, which is known to be around 0.05% to 0.1%.
Okay, so that's quite reassuring to hear that the fatality rate for Omicron in particular is still relatively low, especially if you're a younger person. But staying on the vaccination front, even though they're much more unlikely to get seriously ill. Vaccinations for children, providing they have their parents' consent, of course, between the ages of 5 to 11, will soon be able to get vaccinated.
That's right. Health authorities are planning to announce detailed plans on inoculating children aged 5 to 11 next Monday. Last month, the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety gave the green light for Pfizer's vaccine for kids in this age bracket. Authorities are saying that it is important to vaccinate those who are at high risk or those with weakened immune systems, as the studies show that the vaccine is effective in preventing severe illness. Their decision also comes as the virus is spreading rapidly among those aged 11 and under. Last week, infections among children in this age group stood close to 32,000, and this is an increase of tenfold compared to what was seen a month ago. Given the situation, authorities say they will put much effort into administering vaccines to young children as soon as possible.
All right, Min-jung, thank you so much for your report. Talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving on, but staying with coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic death toll globally has now surpassed 6 million.
This comes just over 2 years since the pandemic first broke out in China, but experts believe the actual death toll is likely much, much higher since record-keeping in many countries is far from ideal. Kim Da-mi reports.
The global death toll from COVID-19 has hit the 6 million mark. The figure comparable Worldometer reached 6,010,000 as of Monday. The U.S. has the most deaths, followed by Brazil, India, Russia, and Mexico. South Korea is 65th on the list, with over 9,000 deaths as of Monday. But experts point out the current death toll might be just the tip of the iceberg.
That takes into account, undiagnosed deaths that happen at home, undercounting, underreporting because lack of testing, and that's all happening in the developing countries.
South Africa has seen over 3.5 million cases and just over 99,500 deaths have been confirmed since the start of the pandemic. The low vaccination rate there has also played a role in the death toll.
If they had been vaccinated, maybe they could have survived the virus. That's what I believe.
Experts note the crisis in Ukraine could bring up the death toll, with a large number of unvaccinated Ukrainian refugees flowing into Eastern European countries like Poland and Hungary. While over 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees have fled over the past 10 days, those countries do provide them with vaccines for free but do not carry out infection tests. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
The UN Security Council convened a closed-door meeting Monday to address North Korea's latest missile launch, but fell short of adopting an official statement condemning the regime's violations of related resolutions. This coming as the U.S. and its European allies on the Council failed to convince China and Russia to back a statement. Kim Hyo-san tells us more.
The UN Security Council has failed to reach a substantive outcome in its latest meeting to address North Korea's ballistic missile activities. The U.S. and its European allies on the Council failed to convince China and Russia to back an official statement condemning the North's violations of existing resolutions. Following Monday's closed-door meeting, the U.S. ambassador to the UN urged members of the Council to speak with one voice.
But let us start with the basic premise that the Council has a responsibility to speak publicly about clear and repeated violations of Security Council resolutions. We call on all Council members to speak with one voice in condemning these dangerous and unlawful acts.
The statement was backed by 10 other ambassadors, including countries not on the Security Council, such as Australia and Japan. Cho Hyun, Seoul's ambassador to the UN, also endorsed a statement saying the Council must publicly address the North's launches, which are clear and repeated violations of UNSC resolutions. The diplomats also reaffirmed their commitment to engage diplomatically with the North. The meeting came some 48 hours after the North conducted its 9th weapons test of the year. Meanwhile, the U.S. nuclear watchdog has spotted signs of activity at North Korea's main Yongbyon nuclear complex, as well as at other facilities. The IAEA also detected ongoing indications of activity at the Gangsan Uranium Enrichment Complex and at the Pyeongsan Uranium Mine and Concentration Plant. The head of the agency said the continuation of North Korea's nuclear program is deeply regrettable, stressing it's a clear violation of UN resolutions. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts that delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. On Saturday, one of the Chinese Communist Party's biggest meetings of the year, the National People's Congress, that is part of the so-called Two Sessions, was held in Beijing. Watchers paying especially close attention this year as it comes ahead of the CCP's National Congress in the fall, and that is when the party is going to, or at least very likely going to, undergo a leadership shake-up, and President Xi Jinping is going to start his third term. However, as with most of the other international news these days, this meeting is largely being overshadowed naturally by Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
And China's refusal to condemn Moscow for its actions also continues to set it at odds with the vast majority of the international community. For more, we connect to Mark Barry, Associate Editor Emeritus of the International Journal on World Peace. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
So before we get to the meeting, let's start with Beijing's stance on the war in Ukraine. The CCP has flat out refused to condemn Russia and has even refrained from calling it an invasion. So can you explain Beijing's reasoning behind this?
Well, I want to say up front that with the Ukraine invasion, in my lifetime, I think we're in uncharted waters. Last week's Russian shelling of Ukraine's largest nuclear facility is something that never happened before. Fortunately, no reactor was hit, but if electricity or plumbing were damaged, there could have been a meltdown far greater than Chernobyl, poisoning Russia, Europe, and the world. Now, supportive Chinese rhetoric aside, Xi Jinping had no idea that Russia's Ukraine invasion would be so extensive or of long duration. Xi also didn't expect the global support mobilized on Ukraine's behalf and the rapid sanctioning of Russia. So China hoped to look the other way as Ukraine was invaded, but now I think it's in a situation where it may have to bail out Russia economically, meaning China would have to take on not one but two basket cases, North Korea and Russia. Also, Russia historically never has been trustworthy to China. Not only were there serious Sino-Soviet border skirmishes in the 1950s and 60s, but in 1929, Stalin briefly invaded northern Manchuria to take control of the Chinese Eastern Railway. So President Xi knows that at any time and for any reason, Putin could pivot and militarily threaten China.
Well, for all the show that they're like good buddies on the international front, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, they have been meeting a lot over the past few years. Like you say, there is this trust issue between the two sides. No one can deny that. And you also touched upon the fact that we're in uncharted territory right now. There is a view in Taiwan by many people that this action taken by Russia could be somewhat of a preview of a Chinese invasion of their island. So hypothetically speaking, it may have changed now that Beijing has seen how Russia is kind of getting bogged down in Ukraine. But how do you expect the international community to act if China were to invade Taiwan? Would we just get a bunch of strong worded statements? Would we get these rock-hard sanctions, or would we potentially get even a military response?
I think China must be rethinking its options over Taiwan, given the international reaction to Ukraine. But many military analysts doubt that China currently has the amphibious assault capability to invade Taiwan. Moreover, Taiwan, I would call it the golden goose. An invasion would kill its vibrant economy, and Taiwan likely has plans to sabotage its world-class chip fabrication plants like TSMC, so China wouldn't be able to use them after an invasion. Finally, the U.S. is Taiwan's main arms supplier and the chief guarantor of security in the sea lanes of communication in the South China Sea region. It's highly likely to come to Taiwan's defense if attacked, and supported by Japan, Australia, and even by South Korea.
Now, Mark, turning back to China's National People's Congress, as we noted, many experts expect a big reshuffle as President Xi Jinping prepares to start his third term. So what do you think is the reason behind this?
I think the main reason Xi has to reshuffle new personnel is to prevent the formation or strengthening of factions against him. There is opposition to Xi, and he knows where it's coming from. So President Xi weakens pockets of opposition by reshuffling, by bringing in new blood, so that he can guarantee his reappointment as leader at the Party Congress later this year. There are many in China's leadership who are unhappy with his imposition of highly centralized authority reminiscent of China under Mao, and are disturbed by the curbs that are placed on China's most prominent entrepreneurs.
Okay, unfortunately, Mark, we are out of time, but it's always a pleasure to speak to you, and we look forward to hearing from you again soon. Thank you ever so much.
You're welcome.
With Russia's invasion of Ukraine almost into its third week and the death, devastation and family separations intensifying by the day now, the international community is ramping up efforts to support the war-torn country and to try and deter Moscow from further attacks by holding talks and vowing to send more military hardware and support to Ukraine. The UN Security Council is also currently holding a briefing on the situation. Song Yoo-jin with this report.
Entering the 13th day since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the United Nations Security Council has taken action. The UNSC is currently holding a briefing on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, where representatives of member states are discussing the devastating situation that Kyiv has been facing since late February. The intensity of the situation can be reflected through the growing number of civilian deaths. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has confirmed that at least 406 civilians, including 27 children, have lost their lives since the start of Russia's attack. However, it added that the real figure is likely to be higher as intense fighting has delayed the agency's receipt of information. Also, more than 1.7 million people to have left Ukraine, with over 1 million of them having headed to Poland. Meanwhile, in an effort to support U.S. forces in Europe in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. Department of Defense has ordered the deployment of additional troops and military assets to different parts of Europe. The Pentagon announced on Monday local time that a total of 500 troops and KC-135 refueling aircraft will be dispatched, although the exact number of aircrafts was not specified. This will bring the total number of U.S. military personnel currently stationed in Europe to around 100,000. Air support operation centers will be set up in Poland and Romania, while ordnance and maintenance companies will be sent to Germany to provide logistic support to German troops. The U.S. also held an emergency video call with Germany, the UK, and France on Monday, reaffirming their joint stance that Russia should pay the price for its unprovoked onslaught. The four state leaders also promised to continue security, economic, and humanitarian support for Kyiv. Over in Ukraine, a third round of talks with Russia ended with no major breakthroughs. Progress was only made in an agreement to evacuate civilians in Ukraine through humanitarian corridors on Tuesday. Both sides promised to meet for a fourth time in Belarus in the near future, while the foreign ministers of the two countries are slated to meet in Turkey on Thursday, marking the first talks between the top diplomats since the invasion began. 송유진, Arirang News.
South Korea has been included on Russia's new list of what Moscow is labeling, quote, unfriendly countries. The government of the Russian Federation approved on Monday a list of foreign states and territories taking what it called unfriendly actions against Russia. The US, the UK, the EU, Australia, Japan and Ukraine were among others on the list. All of those on that list have joined or imposed sanctions of their own against Russia's economy following Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. We now cross over to our Yoon for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight. Entering the 12th day of its invasion, Russian forces continued heavy shelling in Ukraine, with Kiev officials saying that civilians are being targeted, including in hospitals, schools and residential areas. A third round of talks on Monday between their foreign ministers ended without anything tangible or conclusive, and there's growing concern that the war may stretch on for months and even years to come. We discussed the latest developments today with Bruce Jones, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. It's lovely to see you again, Bruce. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on again.
And well, there have been a lot of concerns mounting because, well, after French President Emmanuel Macron talked to Vladimir Putin on the phone on Sunday, he said that Putin was very much determined to see out his see through his so-called denazification of Ukraine. And Macron said that Putin seems pretty resolute on going all the way. For how long do you think the Russian president will be willing to continue with this war?
I think he'll be willing to continue for as long as it takes to achieve what he desires, which is essentially to erase Ukrainian sovereignty, or at the very least to create a political situation inside Ukraine vastly more favorable to Russia, essentially subservient to Russia. I think his odds of succeeding in that are now extremely low, but he can continue to inflict severe costs on Ukraine civilians for a long time to come. I think he'll be willing to continue until he's stopped, and he could be stopped by two things: the scale and sophistication and frankly, just heroism of the Ukrainian resistance, and what appears to be very significant problems of morale within his own armed forces, within the invading force. There appears to be huge confusion, huge morale problems. We don't have full insight into that, obviously. But his operation is not going anywhere like the way it should, and eventually could reach a point where it's not feasible to continue. But that could take months before we reach a point like that.
Well, for now, Ukrainians are left to fend for themselves, really, with equipment from the West, of course. And it seems that they're trying to make the war unwinnable for the Russians. And your Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he said that over time, Ukraine could absolutely win the war. Would you agree with that? Do you think they can continue to put up this strong resistance?
I do. If you look at the situation, Russia is a country of some 140, 150 million people. Ukraine has 43 million people. It's a very large country. This is not, a major power invading some minor country someplace on the other side of the world. This is Ukraine has a substantial capacity to push back on Russian Ukraine, despite the gap in equipment. We've seen huge problems for Russia in its logistics. They clearly fundamentally misunderstood the nature of Ukrainian resistance. Frankly, I think that Ukraine has already defeated Russia from achieving its core objective, which was a sort of a blitzkrieg style operation to take Kiev and install a new government. I think that's now out of reach. We've seen reversals for Russia in several theaters. Obviously, Russia has overwhelming advantages in terms of firepower and continues to shell Kharkiv and Kiev and other cities, inflicting substantial damage and substantial casualties, including to civilians. But their ability to achieve their objectives, I think, is almost out of reach at this stage unless they retreat to more narrow objectives like defending Donetsk and Luhansk as quote-unquote independent entities. That is still an achievable objective. Linking Donetsk to Crimea is still an achievable objective. Taking over the whole of Ukraine, I think, is now essentially out of reach for Russia.
And well, Vladimir Putin does seem pretty annoyed by these sanctions from the West. He said that they're akin to a declaration of war. Do you think this indicates that the sanctions are working? And also, what other measures is the US preparing to take?
The sanctions are much more far-reaching than he had any reason to expect. They're much more far-reaching than most people expected. I think he believed that he could weather the sanctions because he has major reserves, but the sanctions to the central bank are really going to make that much, much more difficult for him. We're going to see this starting to hit. We've already seen the ruble falling very substantially. We'll see it fall farther. We'll see the stock market fall dramatically. We'll see all sorts of kinds of shortages and constraints inside Russia. Unfortunately, those are going to hit the Russian population as well as the oligarchs. I think we'll see more sanctions on the oligarchs. We may see more sanctions on financial institutions. The big thing that the United States and others are holding back is sanctions on oil. That's both because the effect will be limited in the short term. If they sanction the oil sector, we'll simply see a big spike in the price of oil. That's problematic for the rest of the world, but it'll also mean in the short term increased revenues for the Russians. Over time, it's problematic, but in the short term, it's not. So I think they'll hold back on oil sanctions for now, although you are seeing a number of countries driven by their populations move to divorce themselves from Russian oil, but that will take years. That's not something that can be done overnight. So that one, so far, people are holding back on, and we'll see the sanctions really start to bite in the coming days, weeks, and then months. And the real question in my mind is, how long is the Russian system able to tolerate that level of pressure? Of course, they've been able to tolerate pressure before. And the oligarchs around Putin don't have a lot of leverage over him. So this could go on, unfortunately, for a very long period of time.
Well, Putin has said that he will adapt to the sanctions, but the impact of it does seem pretty inevitable in the long run. And well, do you think that Russia can then turn to their neighbors in Beijing?
Only to a modest degree. China at this stage is not going to risk getting cut off from European and American financial institutions by violating the sanctions. We've already seen that major Chinese institutions are restricting their lending. That's to avoid the consequences for themselves. They'll do some modest things. There'll be some leakage in the sanctions. We already saw China increasing its wheat purchasing program from Russia. That will help Russia a little bit. If there are restrictions on oil, China will buy as much Russian oil as it can get its hands on. But there's a limit to the extent to which China can bail Russia out here. They can buffer it at the edges. They can't really dull the full impact of the sanctions.
Well, a New York Times report recently cited that a Western intelligence report said Beijing seemed to have been somewhat aware of Russia's plans for invasion, and the attack was actually delayed until after the Beijing Olympics was held. Do you think, if true, this indicates that China is comfortable with these developments, and whether do you think they're in support of Russia's actions?
There is zero chance that Putin traveled to Beijing, met with Xi Jinping, signed a 5,000-word declaration on this unlimited friendship between the two countries, and didn't mention to him that he was about to invade Ukraine. There's zero chance that that's true. It's self-evidently the case that China knew about the invasion. The U.S. intelligence about asking for the delay until the Olympics, it seems logical, but I can't verify that. But there's no question that Xi Jinping knew about this. My guess is that he assumed that it would go much better than it's gone. And that he wouldn't look so out of step with the rest of the international community, because both of their assumptions would be that Russia would have performed much better, been able to have secured the results much more quickly, that the West would have been more divided. So it's quite possible that she miscalculated. It's possible that he feels a little bit misled by Putin. We don't know that. My assumption is that they're not particularly comfortable, given how badly this is going. Given the weaknesses in the Russian setup that this has exposed. On the other hand, I think it's clear that China, for some time now, has made the determination that it will look to displace the West from the commanding heights of international order, that it will seek to challenge American hegemony over the order, especially the security order over time, other dimensions as well, economic, technological, etc. I do not mean that that necessarily involves the same kind of tactics that Putin has used in Ukraine. But for a long time, China's been quite happy to have Russia out there taking greater risks, being very aggressive, being assertive, causing trouble for the West. China gets to sit back and play the kind of larger game. But in this case, I think it's absolutely clear that China has gave Putin a diplomatic green light for what happened here.
Well, will this crisis affect China's calculations and its competition with the US and also its ambitions in the South China Sea, do you think?
My strong guess is that the Chinese aren't going to make that judgment for several months to come. There's no reason for them to reach hasty conclusions. We're still only 12 days in. This could look very different. But at the very least, they have to be noticing the degree of unity, not only in Europe, but the extent to which America's Asian friends and partners and allies like South Korea, like Japan, like Singapore, etc., rallied to support the sanctions and the technology export restrictions against Russia. They have to notice that. I hope that they are paying attention to how much it is the case that a determined population can resist an invasion. My own view is that a sort of full-blown military invasion of Taiwan from Beijing is not Xi Jinping's first choice or second choice or third choice. I'm sure he hasn't ruled it out, but it's certainly not their their preferred strategy for dealing with Taiwan. I think they'll have many other approaches before they go for a full invasion. So the lessons are not that direct. And there's a fundamental difference. In Ukraine, we had an essentially sort of loud rhetoric from the West, but there was no actual, Western troop presence in Ukraine other than a few trainers, etc. But in the case of Taiwan, the rhetoric is a lot softer. But there's the Seventh Fleet between the Chinese mainland and Formosa Island, and that's a very big barrier, a very big military barrier to whatever Xi's ambitions might be.
And well, in the meantime, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, he warned that if the West does not increase military aid, then Moscow would advance on the rest of Europe. Do you think the world should be prepared for such a scenario where Putin attacks a NATO country?
I mean, we obviously have to be prepared for it. I think it is fundamentally different to attack NATO versus a non-NATO actor. Those are very different things. I have no doubt that Putin went into Ukraine believing that this would go much, much better, and that at the end of it, he would have consolidated his position in Ukraine, as well as Belarus, by the way, and be in a stronger position to threaten and to challenge NATO. And if we had seen weakness and hesitation and division in NATO, then his calculation might be to kind of go for it and to actually make a break into the Baltics or something similar to try to really sow dissent and break Article 5 of NATO. But of course, we've seen this horrible military performance from his forces inside Ukraine, and we've seen substantial unity in NATO, a major change in German foreign policy. We're seeing changes in the foreign policy of all the major Baltic states, or sort of Nordic states, excuse me. And so I think his options are now much weaker than they were. I think his ability to challenge NATO and his borders now is much weaker than it was at the beginning of this, ironically, given his stated goals.
And of course, no one can really confirm or be sure of what's running through the Russian president's mind. But do you think it really is the revival of the Soviet Union or revenge on America and the West?
You know, when a guy like Putin tells you that he intends to restore the Russian Imperium, and he tells you again and again and again, at a certain point you should listen. And he's been telling us for years and years and years that he believes that that Russia should restore Russian Imperium, not just Soviet Imperium, but Russian Imperium. So surely that is in his mind. Surely that is his ambition. Whether it's his actual plan is a very different thing. I've worked with a lot of people like Putin, a lot of leaders like Putin. In my experience, what they do is they do not decide what their tactics are in advance. They are constantly reevaluating their choices. They're constantly reevaluating the situation. They devote every waking minute of their day to increasing their ability to have flexibility, both domestically and internationally. So I would have high confidence in saying that he went into Ukraine not knowing where it would end, not knowing what his next step would be, confident in his ability to roll with the punches, so to speak. And I think has been badly surprised by the scale of Ukrainian opposition and by the scale of Western response. But that by no means is Russia out of options. By no means are they out of tools to pressure the West, cyber, energy, and other, let alone the use of sort of the rhetoric of nuclear escalation as a form of blackmail and threat.
Well, that was Bruce Jones, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me on.
Turning now to South Korea's presidential election, a record number of people turned out for early voting over the weekend. But the National Election Commission has been coming under fire for what critics say was its mishandling of ballots. In response, the committee vowed to prevent such incidents occurring again on March 9th, Election Day. One change is allowing COVID-19 patients to leave their isolation quarters to vote after 5:50 p.m. instead of 5 p.m. Kim Yeon-sung with the details.
A third apology coming from the National Election Commission over Saturday's voting mishap.
We deeply apologize for causing confusion and discomfort to many people with the voting process for COVID-19 patients.
Last Saturday, during early voting, COVID-19 patients and those in isolation could cast their votes between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. But many who voted during this time frame complained of long lines and of COVID-19 voters and regular voters not being properly separated. But the main problem was with ballot boxes. Ballots of COVID-19 voters were seemingly thrown into bags or plastic containers rather than using the official ballot boxes. Although it had been NEC's intention to separate the ballots of the infected and regular voters to prevent any health risks, this setup led some to doubt whether the voting had been properly managed. To make sure there isn't a repeat of this misstep on Election Day, the NEC on Monday morning held an emergency meeting. On Election Day, polling stations will once again open for COVID-19 patients and those in isolation from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. after voting wraps up for regular voters. Ahead of this last chance to vote, the NEC had made several tweaks to the process during Monday's meeting. For example, for early voting, those with COVID-19 and those in isolation could go out after 5 p.m. But to prevent long waits, on Election Day, the allowed time they can leave will be from after 5:50 p.m. The NEC is also increasing the number of booths so that the lines move along quicker. They will also make sure that voters with COVID-19 are clearly separated from other voters. And this time, there won't be a separate polling booth or ballot box for those who are COVID-19 infected or are self-isolating. All the votes are going straight into the official ballot box in order to ease any concerns among voters. Kim Yeon-sung, Arirang News.
There's now just a day of campaigning left ahead of Wednesday's presidential election in South Korea. And on Monday, the candidates were crisscrossing the country in last-minute bid to win the hearts and minds of undecided voters. The ruling Democratic Party's nominee started on the southern island of Jeju and ended his day in Chungcheongbuk-do province. Jae-myung used the opportunity to highlight his political experience compared to his main rival. Kim Do-yeon reports.
On the second-to-last day of the official campaigning period, the ruling Democratic Party of Korea's presidential candidate Lee Jae-myung was out looking to convince those who are still undecided, claiming that he has a proven political track record. His first stop of the day was on Jeju Island.
On March 9th, the fate of Jeju and the fate of the nation will be decided. We need to go toward a unified and happy future, not back to the past. We need to make a peaceful world without war, hate, conflict, and mass killings, don't we?
Making his way onto the mainland, his next stop was Busan, the nation's second largest city. He promised to boost the city's economy as well as the whole of the south through his plans to create a southern capital region. He also addressed any immediate concerns of summer tourism, as Busan is one of the most popular spots for summer vacation.
The city should welcome many visitors for summer vacation this year and have small business owners and local stores be better off financially, shouldn't it? If I become the president, I will make sure people's livelihoods and the economy is restored by the end of this summer.
He then made his way north to Daegu, a stronghold for his conservative opposition, but also the region he was born in. In the past, the Daegu region has produced a number of presidents from the conservative side, so he asked voters here to make him the region's first one elected from Liberal Democratic Party of Korea. And he pledged to rise above the ordinary spectrum of politics and unify the country. In the late afternoon, he was joined by Kim Dong-yeon in Chungcheongbuk-do province, who dropped out of the race last week to support Lee Jae-myung. Kim, who is from the region, urged voters to choose Lee to break up the political establishment and successfully reform the country's politics. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Yoon Suk-yeol of the main opposition People Power Party campaigned on Monday in Gyeonggi-do province. In the region with the most votes up for grabs, Yoon again called for a change of government, criticizing both the ruling party and its candidate. Lee Kyung-eun with this report.
Yoon Suk-yeol of the main opposition People Power Party holding his hands up together with An Chol-soo of the People's Party. It's Yoon's second joint rally with An following their campaign merger. Addressing supporters in Gyeonggi-do province, Yoon criticized the Democratic Party over its 28 rounds of housing policy revisions, calling it an intended failure.
How can we call it a mistake when it failed 28 times? They are trying to prevent people from buying a home due to an argument that property owners tend to lean conservative.
Then Yoon channeled into his ultimate slogan calling for a change of government, seeking a fresh boost for his push through his partnership with An, who says his forward-looking outlook combined with Yoon's fairness can make a better country.
Yoon Suk-yeol will be campaigning all day here in Gyeonggi-do province, the battleground region saw one of the lowest early voter turnouts, perhaps suggesting many are still undecided, and Yoon will likely focus on winning over those swing voters.
To do so, Yoon also tagged the DP's Lee Jae-myung over his claims that he's the best choice for the economy.
Lee keeps talking about the economy. He's trying to use that image of savior of the economy to hide so much corruption surrounding him. The economy is not something that the president saves.
This is also seen as his counterattack following the latest controversy sparked by an audio clip allegedly pointing at his involvement in the very scandal he used to attack Lee. While the DP is ramping up the offensive over this, the PPP is turning its own attack on the DP over its responsibility for the controversial mismanagement of early voting. Young-eun, Arirang News.
With the election set for Wednesday, today is the final day of campaigning for the candidates vying to become South Korea's next president. The two front-runners will hold their final major rallies in downtown Seoul near the Gwanghwamun area, a symbol of South Korean democracy where the country's now famous candlelight vigil was held and beamed around the world a few years ago. Lee Jae-myung of the ruling Democratic Party of Korea will hold his at 7 p.m. Korea time at Cheonggae Plaza. The candidate for the main opposition People Power Party, Yoon Suk-yeol, will hold his 90 minutes later at Seoul Plaza, located in front of Seoul City Hall. Both will also be visiting Seoul's popular university areas to tout their policies to younger voters, a group deemed crucial to win over and to stand a chance of emerging victorious in the election. Under law, all campaigning must stop at midnight, but the candidates are expected to squeeze every last minute out of the final day and hold speeches right up until that time. Now, for a look at news from around the world, we turn to our Easing Jae, who's joining us from our Arirang newsroom. Good morning.
Good morning to you guys.
So let's start off in Mali, where the French army announced on Monday that a senior leader of al-Qaeda was killed.
That's right. So the French army said Monday that its anti-jihadist force in Mali had killed Yahya Jouani, a senior leader of al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Now, Jouani, an Algerian, also known as Abu Ammar al-Jazari, was killed overnight between February 25th and 26th, roughly 160 kilometers north of Timbuktu in central Mali. Now, in the statement, the French army also noted that he was killed by ground forces, supported by a Tiger attack helicopter and 2 drones. Jouani was a major link to al-Qaeda in northern Mali, known for coordinating supplies, financing, and logistics for the terrorist group. Now, nearly 400 civilians have been killed in attacks in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over the country last year. Now, according to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, on Monday, of the 397 civilians killed in the country, more than 80% were at the hands of the Islamic State, as she underscored the scale of insurgency faced by the new government. While ISIS-K first appeared in eastern Afghanistan in late 2014, the group is thought to have spread further in the wake of the Taliban takeover and have been blamed for several suicide attacks in recent months, including one at Kabul airport last August. The latest report is the first major human rights report since the Taliban seized power and covers the period from August 2021 to the end of February 2022. Now, over in Egypt, a landmark moment in the country's judicial history on Sunday as 98 women took seats at the State Council. The appointment follows a presidential decree in October 2021, which resulted in a number of women taking an oath before the head of the State Council ahead of being assigned to various circuit courts. While women have been practicing law in Egypt since the 1930s, none held any judicial positions until 2003, when the first female judge, Tahani El-Gabali, was appointed to the Constitutional Court. Now, in 2021, the World Economic Forum ranked Egypt 129th on the global gender gap list, with the country having significantly closed its total gender gap and made progress in political empowerment, health and survival, as well as educational attainment. And finally, Mexico's top division football league suspended matches Sunday and may ban fans from attending away matches after a massive brawl among supporters last Saturday, which resulted in 17 deaths and injuries to 26 others. The deadly unrest took place during a match between host Querétaro and Atlas, as the match was suspended in the 62nd minute after multiple fights broke out in the stands. State authorities in north-central Mexico have also suspended 5 officials, including police and civil defense employees, over the brawl.
Good morning. The massive wildfire that started last Friday in East Coast regions, including Ulsan, Gyeonggi-do province, is still spreading. And today looks to be another ideal day for wildfires to move. We have very dry conditions and winds have been variable, so please take fire safety precautions. Warm southwesterly winds and sunshine will boost the highs to double digits by the afternoon, but you need to chilly start further south with sub-zero morning temperatures to start out the day. Morning temperatures are similar to slightly higher than the same time yesterday, and Gyeonggi and Chungcheon are beginning the day at just -3 degrees Celsius. Then highs will be 2 to 5 degrees higher than yesterday, Seoul going up to 12 degrees. Daegu, Gyeonggi topping out at 17 degrees this afternoon. But dust levels could rise at night in the capital and Chungcheongbuk-do provinces. Weather looks promising on our presidential election day tomorrow. Then on Sunday, we can expect some much-needed nationwide rainfall. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that's all we have for now. We'll be back at 8 a.m. Korea time Wednesday for our next edition of New Day at Arirang. We appreciate you tuning in. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Bream. Thank you as always for watching. Until next time, goodbye.